It's Wednesday, June 8th. And did you know that in America, 1 in 14 people have experienced homelessness at some point in their lives? And the ripple effects are felt throughout American society. In schools, churches, hospitals, libraries, and subway stations. Think about all the stories that we have heard about the subway stations in New York and the homeless living there, right? So at any given time in this country, roughly 500,000 people in the U.S. live in homeless shelters, or worse yet, they live on the street. If you've ever seen those pictures of the shacks and canvas dwellings that exist in Los Angeles and San Francisco on the sidewalks of major thoroughfare. So it's a terrible situation in this country that we have so many homeless people, and we are a great nation. But not that great, not so great that we can take care of everybody, not so great that everybody can earn an honest living. Now I know that there are many people who are not equipped to work, and they need help, and we're failing in that area because we worry about too many other things. So we have millions of people living on the brink, scrambling each month to keep a roof over their heads. And we still have 50 million people living at the poverty level. So what are we going to do about it? I don't know. I don't know what the answer is. It's just another conundrum that we are facing, along with the other faults, I will call them faults in our society, because we are so split. Death among the homeless actually spiked during the pandemic. But it wasn't from COVID. It was from drugs, because these people had to find a way to cope with what was going on around them. So instead of doing what most people might do, what most people who have housing would do, they could not find shelter. They could not hide from the pandemic. So they took to using more drugs. In fact, not a single death in some parts of the homeless communities was caused by the pandemic. So that's an amazing statistic when you think about it, but it's awful when you think about it in other ways. That we have poor and probably unbalanced people living on the streets. And then we have people who are perfectly well balanced, but they're living in their car or something like that because they can't find a decent job. And let's face it, in many parts of this country, you cannot afford to live in a decent place. Housing is insane in this country. And while we have a low minimum wage comparatively, people cannot afford, in many cases, to rent an apartment. And so they find themselves on the street, or living in a car, or living in a subway station. Now that's awful when you think about it. It's a terrible thing that the homeless population in the last 2 years has grown by 10%. And these are not one-night stands. These are people that are living, breathing on the streets. And let's face it, we don't have enough homeless shelters in this country. And I don't understand why we even need homeless shelters. There has to be a better way. We're not dealing with this any better than we're dealing with any of the other major crises that are going on in this country. And it's a disgrace. It's a disgrace. Another part of this very ugly situation, in many parts of the country where the homeless reside, there are crackdowns on these people. These people are out on the street because they can't afford, or they choose not to afford to live in some place where there's rent to be paid. But in any event, the local authorities are pissed off and are chasing these people, rounding them up like cattle and putting them in shelters if they have room in the shelters, or chasing them someplace else. Why? Why can't we have an organized setup to take care of these people before they end up on the streets? So they're on the streets and they're being harassed by the local authorities, and probably with fairly good reason, because maybe there's people in the neighborhood who object to these people on the streets. Or they're in the way of people trying to get to and from work, or whatever it is, wherever they set up these encampments. And many of these encampments are set up in tunnels, in those little bridges that reside under highways and things like that. You know what I'm talking about. But it's a mess. It's a mess, and it's a shanda that we in the United States are faced with so many homeless people, and we haven't figured out what to do with it. And we haven't made an arrangement, so to speak. I mean, in New York City, they're living in the parks. There are several parks in New York City that are just sort of set aside for the homeless. There's another terrible side to this whole situation. There are many homeless people who don't want to accept help. They are refusing the help that's offered to them from their communities. They don't want to be in debt to anybody, so to speak. They don't want anybody in control of their lives. They found a way to live, and they're content with it. I mean, there are many in New York City who seek out those warm spots, those grates in the sidewalk where there's heat coming out from the subway tunnels or heat from buildings that escape. And people set up their homeless housing in those areas. And they're content to stay there, and they don't want to go to the shelters. They don't want, I don't know whether they think they're in debt to the society or they'll be governed, and they don't want to be governed. So it's a mess. And we, of course, don't have the time to figure that out because we have too many other major crises on our hands. And these are left to the localities. This is not a national disgrace, so to speak. It's a local disgrace. Big cities like San Diego, Los Angeles, San Francisco, and I named the West Coast because it's pretty bad out there. But I'm sure it's bad in Florida, and I know it's bad in New York City. And in many other major cities, there's always a homeless population that needs to be taken care of. So, I am sorry for the bad news this morning, but that's the way it is.